Hello, everyone. I'm your host for today. We are waiting another minute or two to have more people joining us before we start. Thank you. I think we can start. Hello, and a warm welcome to you all. I see 153 participants in the room. A warm welcome to you all from everywhere in the world that you're joining us today. You are at the fourth webinar of a series of webinars that UNITAR and the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions have been organizing since the past couple of years. My name is Marnouche Azodi. I'm a program management officer at the Secretariat of BRS Conventions, and I'm your moderator for today's session. I work on the plastic waste technical assistance within the BRS conventions. And for some of you who may be joining us for the first time, Basel, Rotterdam, and the Stockholm conventions are the three key multilateral environmental agreements which are globally recognized to address hazardous chemicals and waste. The overall objective of these three conventions is to protect human health and the environment from the adverse impacts of hazardous chemicals and waste. Most notably is the plastic waste amendments of the Basel Conventions, well, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It came into effect in 2021, and it's currently the only legally binding instrument that regulates the trade of plastic waste worldwide. UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, is a dedicated training arm of the United Nations system. It has a mandate to enhance the effectiveness of the UN through diplomatic training and to increase the impact of national actions through public awareness raising, education, and training of public policy officials. With this brief introduction, let's delve into our webinar today. As briefly mentioned, this is the fourth webinar that UNITAR and BRS conventions have organized together. The other three webinars were recorded. As you can see, the list of them now up on the screen momentarily. If these topics are of any of interest to you, yes, now you can see them on the screen. That there were three other webinars. Check out those recordings on the UNITAR website. For today, we have three presentations lined up for you, after which there will be a question and discussion session with our speakers. Keep your questions and comments until the very end, or you can also drop them in the chat box throughout the session. And at the end, we will have a wrap up and concluding remarks given by Mr. Oliver Wooten, the Senior Program Specialist at UNITAR. So without further ado, our first speaker is Dr. Michael Bank. He works as a senior scientist at the Institute of Marine Research in Bergen, Norway. He also serves as an adjunct professor of contaminants and complex systems at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the United States. His research is highly interdisciplinary and is focused on three principal themes: how contaminants affect organisms, including humans, how can contaminants in ecosystem compartments be modeled, and how can this information be used in the scientific translation and environmental governance. With this short overview, Dr. Bang will provide you more details into his research work. I welcome you, Dr. Bang. We're very pleased to have you, and floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And hopefully you can hear me clearly. I'll begin sharing my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see the presentation clearly. Um, Hi again, my name is Michael Bank. I'm with the Norwegian government and also a professor at UMass Amherst in complex systems, mathematics, and contaminants. I have been working with microplastics probably for about the last 5 years and very happy and privileged to join the webinar today. And it's very meaningful to me that you've come and very meaningful to Unitar that there's so many people interested in this important topic. Now, I'd like to start off by just acknowledging some of the funding agents that allow for this work to be uh, shared with everyone today. It's a wide array of different groups, and I've also been very fortunate to be involved in formal advising at the United Nations through very different groups, most recently with the GO7 program, but also with FAO and IAEA in the past and other groups as well. It also shows the power of network and what we can do collectively as a team and community of scientists. Now, just a small background on what how I come at this important environmental, excuse me, issue. I am heavily involved in machine learning modeling and contaminants. I use logic-based models to understand complex systems in the context of environmental and planetary health. My research themes are pretty diverse with regard to the different types of contaminants, ranging from toxic metals and rare earth elements to emerging contaminants and microplastics. And I also do some work with pathogens and antifungal and antibiotic resistance. Now, today's outline, I'll give a very brief background on environmental pollution and how the microplastic pollution situation fits within the larger scale and scope of the sort of planetary polycrisis that we've been facing with regard to biodiversity impacts, as well as pollution and climate change. And then I'll provide you with a couple of case studies involving lithification of microplastics, some case studies from China and India, and then also discuss plastospheres or the ecosystems that grow on microplastic particles. And then I'll close the talk by providing some outlook on public policy, along with some synthesis of the material presented today. Now, as most of you know, the current situation with the environment has been synthesized by many different scientists that we're facing a triple planetary crisis of species loss, climate change, and pollution. This is probably one of the key environmental issues of our time. And at the core of this is the food system and fossil fuel production, which was recently estimated to be nearly 5 billion per hour in environmental damage by the new UN Environmental Program GO7 flagship report that just came out last December. Now, this is important because, planetary health has become front and center for many communities who are facing challenges with regard to, say, subsistence fisheries or agriculture in their local communities because of challenges due to climate change and pollution. Microplastic is not only a problem for the ocean, it's also a significant issue on land and in air, as we'll discuss today through the different ecosystem compartments. But most of my work is putting the ocean into context with air and land sea exchange processes. So I see the ocean as a key central ecosystem for research and public policy, but it has to be connected to both land and sea freshwater systems as well, like rivers, to make it more holistic and meaningful for public policymakers. Now, regarding the new World Ocean Assessment, which just came out on June 8th, just a few days ago, these are the most recent calculations coming out of the UN that there's roughly about 52.1 million tons of plastic per year enter the ocean, contributing to approximately 24.4 trillion microplastic particles that impact more than 4,000 species. This is a daunting number, and you can see some of the pictures here outlining the problem in West Africa, as well as looking at some microplastic fibers on the seabed. Now, a lot of people often ask, like, how did we get here and how did we find out about the problem? And like most environmental pollution problems, it's wildlife, or fish and wildlife, I should say, that are really the indicators of the Anthropocene with regard to environmental impacts from environmental pollution. Now, the animals here, the black-footed albatross in the upper right, this is from the Midway Atoll in the Hawaiian island system, which is greater than 1,000 miles from any landmass. This was a photograph from 2009 by activist and photographer Chris Jordan, who really helped put the issue into context with regard to the global scale of the problem. I think the reason this photograph was so impactful for many people is because they recognize some of the waste materials inside the bird, which ultimately died from thirst. You can see things like bottle caps and small toys and fishing line, things that people have used in their lifetime, and this kind of resonates with people. And this was a real turning point for plastic pollution, and then also the subsequent research that led to focusing on microplastics. Now, we know that microplastics are distributed throughout all ecosystem compartments in all regions of the world. The Arctic is a specific system which is very sensitive and an important receptor region. Um, you often see microplastics from tires get picked up by wind or ocean currents, although the wind is really a really important one. And this atmospheric deposition issue of microplastics has really become a front and center issue for public policy. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But here you can see in a deposition map put out by Evangelou et al. In 2020, the deposition, going from a cool blue to a hot red, purple, and some of the darker colors you can see along the scale that the Arctic is definitely a sensitive ecosystem with regard to microplastic. Now, this is important because in order to put this in context to a larger system, we need to understand that microplastic pollution is essentially a new pollution cycle. And we came up with this idea along with my colleague Sophia Hansen from University of Toulouse in France about 5 or 6 years ago. We were talking about this idea about how we could come up with a conceptual model that would be very easy for policymakers to understand. So we put together this model here that's presented first in a paper in ES&T and then in a book chapter, following up and sort of refining the microplastic cycle. And you can see here it starts on land with traffic systems and river transport and also manufacturing on the left center of the figure. There's also things you might recognize from your house, such as laundry and plastic bottles. And these all have inputs with regard to the waste stream. Then there's all sorts of complex movements in and out of the ocean via air-sea exchange, also long-range transport from atmospheric deposition, and then distribution being influenced too by, say, fishing nets and aquaculture, and then beaching of plastics, etc., and then the subsequent degradation of macroplastics or the larger plastic fragments into the smaller microplastic uh, fragments, which are generally thought of below the less than 5 millimeters in size. That's the scale we're dealing with. And then there's trophic transfer, along with the chemicals that are absorbed on microplastic particles in the ocean or, say, freshwater environment, and then trophic transfer throughout the food web, which does include humans. So this cycle model was really important for public policy. It changed how we think about microplastic, going from sort of a more localized contaminant to something that has the potential for long-range transport. And this all of a sudden makes it a very different type of policy and management regime that you'd have to consider to really address it in a more meaningful way. Now, I've been involved in a wide array of different research. This is a part of the case study part of the lecture, where I'll go through a couple of examples of how microplastics are generated in the environment. This was a discovery by a former graduate student at Tsinghua University in Beijing, who made this discovery of a plastic rock complex in Heishi City in China, along the banks of a freshwater creek. And here you can see the plastic is bonded to the rock, as you can see in the photograph on the left. And we looked at polyethylene films and used X-ray diffraction and micro FTIR. And you could read more about this in the paper as you like. And we found that the polyethylene films were chemically bonded to silicon in the rock with the help of oxygen atoms. And then other substances, polypropylene was attached to the rocks via a physical attachment. Some of the hypotheses of how this occurred is due to sunlight and UV and/or microbial communities. And you can read a bit more about this, but basically this was important with regard to shedding. And once these plastic rocks were observed and we put them into an experimental setting, we showed that they shedded a lot of microplastics in the environment. This attachment of the plastic to the rock. It's a very common thing that you see in nature, a plastic bag completely strewn around a rock. And once it sort of makes that bond, we see that this shedding of microplastics is an order of magnitude greater than those reported for landfill environments, seawater, and marine sediment. So this is just one of many ways that microplastic gets into the environment, and we think that this is quite important and is very important with regard to some of the themes related to land-sea exchange processes, how plastic moves from land pollution into the ocean, which is going to be very critical with regard to management. Now, we also know that ocean currents and seafloor microplastic hotspots are really important for policymakers to consider. The deep ocean currents carry not only oxygen, water, and nutrients, but they often can distribute and make drift possible for microplastics, moving them throughout the seabed. And ultimately, the marine sediment is an important sink for microplastics. And then there can be all sorts of changes and adsorbing of chemicals as well as release of chemicals. It gets very complicated very quickly. We also continue with another case study, also from China, looking at the Pearl River estuary right near Hong Kong, one of the most populated watersheds in the world with nearly 80 million people from Macau to Hong Kong. And we looked at marine sediment, as I pointed out earlier, that the microplastic is ultimately headed to ocean sediments as a marine sink of these important emerging contaminants. You can see some of the distribution of the sampling sites in the Pearl River estuary, as well as the location of Hong Kong and Macau in this heavily populated watershed. The simple abundance, you can see as you go offshore, tends to be a little bit less contaminated. And you can see the distribution based on items per uh, kilogram in dry weight. And again, this is a river contributing the microplastic to the ocean. So we know that these are very critical systems to study. And we've been able to do a very simple risk assessment with the graduate student to look at where the risk is highest for the Pearl River estuary. And you can see the role of islands in intercepting some of the microplastics here. So this is a nice example of what could be done with integrating next generation scientist training along with learning about the distribution in a populated watershed in southern China. Now, one of the main reasons that plastic has gained so much attention, in addition to it being overtly visible to the public, is its toxicity problem, meaning that some of the issues related to toxicity may be still yet to come. And it's based on this sort of plastic toxicity debt idea put forward by Matthias Reilly from University of Berlin, who's a close colleague of mine. He had this great idea that, maybe the plastics, and I believe he's correct in this manner, that the degradation takes such a long time, and the chemical additives that are included in plastics are going to be very difficult to manage because the worst may still yet to come with regard to the release of these chemicals in the future. And this is a really nice example and figure to show how this occurs in nature with the degradation of something as simple as a plastic coffee cup lid. Now, we also know that sometimes we overlook things that scientists and the public, although you can see that microplastic is an important issue with regard to the microplastic particles, we think that as a scientific community, it's critical that we do not underestimate the biohazard risk of the microbes and pathogens that are growing and are transported on the biofilm or within the biofilm of the plastic particles. And we wrote this paper a couple of years back in Nature, sort of a call to action to enhance the planetary health risk assessment to include plastospheres, or the ecosystem that grows on plastic particles. Now you can see some of the importance and how these plastospheres are developed in nature. The biofilm grows upon a plastic particle. There could be a multi-species composition where pathogens also attach to these synthetic particles, and this increases disease risk. And also, we know that these particles can be have long distance transport. They can have impacts on wildlife, and there could be impacts on humans as well through an indirect effect. We also know that there can be antibiotic resistant genes spread, antibiotic resistance spread through microplastic pollution and the spread of those particles. Now, this term plastosphere was put forward by Eric Zettler from the Netherlands, going back nearly 13 years ago. So it's not really a new idea, but what has changed is the science with regard to studying these plastospheres with the advancement of machine learning and also metagenomics. Now, this is some work that we've been able to put forward about developing a microplastome led by Chang-Chao Li from Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And he had this idea that we should really be considering the entire exposure regime for terrestrial animals and plants and fresh water and soils and humans in the ocean and other aquatic systems. There's also the airborne microplastome. So each one has this mixture of different contaminants and pathogens, and also other microbial hazards. And we have to consider this as a mixture with regard to its risk, as opposed to a case-by-case individual risk. Now, also, we, as a scientific community, have worked on how to address this from a public policy standpoint. This is a paper I led 5 years ago with a very diverse group of scientists, including those from the United Nations IAEA Marine Science Lab in Monaco, where we looked at how to develop a global plastic observation system, to look at harmonization and standardization of testing, things like atmospheric deposition, what kind of matrices you'd use to consider land, sea, and human health. And then also we thought really deeply about this, that we also it'll be critical to connect with the plastic waste and trade management groups, as well as the existing public policy groups, including the Basel Convention, and the potential for a new plastic convention. So this is an ES&T. It's a full-length article that you can read. It's open access. And I think it's a good place to start, and it can be connected to some of the additives and chemicals also in the plastic particles, which make this a very complex emerging contaminant to address from a policy standpoint. Now, just continuing with our last case study, I actually thought this was quite meaningful. The work by Chakrabarty et al. From 2022, where they looked at these different plastic waste streams in a sort of qualitative way to get an idea about the contributions of different chemicals based on the waste stream category. So they have dump yard waste and e-waste, waste from biomedical facilities, as well as marine litter and industrial waste. And you can see that different contaminants are connected to different types of waste streams. And this is very important to manage and also for setting up prioritization of which industrial waste streams we need to address first in order to get a maximum benefit from public policy. Now, just kind of wrapping up the talk here, I thought it'd be good to talk about policy a little bit. As a government scientist, I'm charged with doing science and providing advice, but I have no role in policy. That's left to politicians and government officials, et cetera, who work at environmental ministries, et cetera. But I do a lot of advising. And one of the things that we've been working on in Norway is trying to get a better handle on the entire pollution life cycle for microplastics, to develop legislation which includes production along with consumption and waste. And this production part is really important, because if we don't get a handle on production, it's not likely we're going to get a handle on waste in a manner that's going to be most efficient to protect environmental and public health. We know that there needs to be better chemical policy alignment, and that financing details need to be addressed, especially as groups are moving forward with the INC 5.4 UN Treaty on Plastics negotiations. We also feel that there are lessons that can be learned from other conventions, including Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, the Minamata Convention on Mercury. All these conventions have learned important lessons that can be shared for some of the new ones, as well as this new UN Chemicals and Waste Science Policy Panel, which I think has enjoyed the benefits of learning from other previous environmental conventions. We also know that sometimes there's a misalignment with existing management, and that sometimes systems need to be updated to address 21st century problems. And we also need to be mindful that plastic production is really an engine, or a primary engine, of climate change, with 99% of these plastic production items being made from fossil fuels. We also know that discharge and the role of a circular economy, a safe economy, is critical to avoid a tenfold increase in ocean microplastics by 2100. By some work I was involved with Bermudez et al., also with the UN IAEA lab in Monaco, that was done near the coast of Ecuador, where we had a long 10-year data set that we've been able to model to show that if we don't get a handle on production, there's going to be dramatic increases. Now, I think the reason and how we got here is because countries do not do well with understanding how to properly consider scientific advice. That is really the main bottleneck to so many issues. And I think there's a way to deal with that is we need to provide training for that. Politicians really need to understand that there's economic, environmental, and public health benefits to considering scientific advice. Now, I'll be wrapping up the talk here with just one more or two more slides. Um, we know that microplastic generation, fate, and transport is complex. There's many pathways. We know that public and policy awareness is really high, and we push for consensus and look for a wide array of stakeholders to help advance this issue in a meaningful and purposeful way to address the problem. And we need to focus on production and upstream pollution to ensure that we get production in the public policy. I think that's been one of the things holding up the UN Plastic Convention negotiations. We also need to advance technology with regard to removing chemicals from plastic, and we certainly can't overlook the biohazard and/or pathogenic risk, sort of this antibiotic resistance connection that we know of with regard to microplastic pollution. And then again, if I'm closing with the human health pathways, these can be very nuanced. Drinking water and seafood and also other exposure routes, they need to be considered more fully. And I think we're probably have a lot of time before we develop a tolerable weekly intake for plastics, but I'm sure it's coming eventually, but it's going to be very interesting how they set that up. Now, just to close out the talk, I thought I'd talk about one or two prioritization areas. I think we need to think about sustainable food systems with regard to plastic and microplastic pollution. I think that's a key one. You can see here in the slide, there's other interesting things that we need to do. I think machine learning will be critical to do some data mining. And then also some of the human health risk assessments really need to consider not only the chemicals, but indirect and direct effects from pathogens. So with that, I'd like to close with this picture that I use in nearly all my talks these days. The ocean is really under threat, and we have a window now that's kind of closing more and more each year about how we can get a handle on it. But there are studies to show that we can clean up the ocean in roughly about 30 years. And it's really like society is this white line in the middle, and we have to make some decisions regarding if we want to keep heading in the direction we're going, which is sort of the top part of the picture, versus the ocean we want, which is really on the bottom of the picture. So with that, I'd like to thank you and just remind you that it's very meaningful to me that you've come today. It's also meaningful to me that you work as hard as you do to address this issue. And whatever your role is, whether you're a scientist, a policymaker, an attorney, or a student, your work is very valuable and meaningful to me. So please keep that in mind. And thank you again for the opportunity. And I'm very grateful for the chance. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bank, for this great presentation. I'm going to code the number, and I hope I'm correct, that 24.4 trillion microplastics enter the marine environment, and that's very striking. We have this pleasure of having scientists today that are involved in policy making. So I hope that you prepare your questions for Dr. Bank and our next two speakers. You stay with us until the very end. I already see a few questions lined up in the chat box. Continue dropping your questions there. Thank you so much, Dr. Bank. It was great. And with that, we move to our second speaker. Our second speaker for today is Professor Michelle Bloor. Dr. Bloor is a professor of environmental science and risk at the University of Glasgow. She's also a research director for Scotland's National Centre for Resilience. Her research explores real-life challenges related to chemicals, waste, and pollution. She will introduce her research in more details with you. We are very pleased to have you with us today, Dr. Bloor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk today, and also for such a large number of people coming to hear from us. As Michael said, we're very appreciative, and we hope in some way that our work can feed into the processes that you're all involved with. So my presentation today is focusing on river sediment contamination and the remobilization of persistent organic pollutants in the plastic uh, system, and specifically focusing on microplastics, because as my presentation will show, there's very little been done around this with regards to nanoplastics at this moment in time. So as been mentioned, I'm a professor of environmental science and risk at the University of Glasgow. And in addition to that, I'm also sort of a chemicals and waste pollution expert. My research is very broad across a wide range of both chemicals and waste. I'm editor-in-chief of the Sustainable Environment Journal, and as mentioned, I'm the research director for Scotland's National Resilience. And I co-lead the University of Glasgow's Global Health and Environment Interdisciplinary Theme. This is a really nice theme, as it's basically working across the entire university to bring all of those researchers together that are working on specific topics to avoid silos, and to ensure that we have really multidisciplinary approaches to the research that we're carrying out. In addition to that, I'm also the Senior Fellow of the University of Glasgow's Centre of Public Policy and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry. You'll notice on some of my slides, I have QR codes, and those are either linking to journal papers that I've made reference to, or to other further information that I think might be of interest to you. So just please bear that in mind. So the work that I'm presenting today is set a little bit different to Michael's, where Michael talked about lots of different projects to give an overview of microplastics in the marine environment. I'm specifically focusing on one study that we undertook, which was a global review of river sediment contamination and remobilization through climate-induced flooding. The research was funded by the National Centre of Resilience, and we had a really in-depth exploration initially of all of the literature that has been published, but then subsequently undertaking some practical work. And I've put a QR code to that paper, if relevant to you, on the screen as well. So we all know that everything around us is made up of chemicals, and chemicals in some way get a bad press because it's usually those harmful or persistent chemicals that people are talking about. Yet the oxygen we breathe and the food that we eat, everything is made up of chemicals, and some of them are really important for our survival. So I always encourage my students in particular is not just to be sort of synonymous with danger or threat or risk when we think about chemicals. And they come from many different sources, of course, and they get into our environment through those different pathways. We obviously have air pollution, we have marine and freshwater pollution, and we also have, of course, the pollution of our soils and terrestrial environment. So everything has the potential to have emissions and associated with chemical contamination. And of course, it's very dependent on particular situations of what those chemical concentrations are that we're exposed with. So there isn't a uniform concentration across any of those pathways. And similarly, all of the multitude of chemicals that are in our environment means that one particular environment is not just going to be potentially contaminated by one substance. It might well be a plethora of substances. A chemical cocktail might well be in place, which is perhaps not the same as anywhere else. So it can be very, very unique as a consequence of that. So I've put up here a really nice chemical iceberg that was initially developed by the European Environment Agency. And it looks at specifically Europe with how many chemicals are on the market. And it's estimated there's around about 100,000 chemicals on the market in Europe. If we equate that figure to the global regions, then we're estimating around about 350,000 chemicals on the global market. But then, of course, you also have some substances that are not necessarily registered as well, which would be in addition to those. So out of all of those chemicals, we don't know everything about all of them. And as such, our understanding of the risk and the hazard and potential exposure to those chemicals is not 100% by any stretch of the imagination. And this diagram just really outlines that there are still quite a percentage of substances that are a little bit unknown, and we still need to do further work. If we then equate that back to the idea of a chemical cocktail and mixtures of chemicals, then if you have more than one chemical in a situation, the responses are likely to be different. And therefore, it has a whole different set of parameters that would need to be investigated and explored. So it's a very, very complex structure and of course, very diverse in its nature. So Michael's already talked a little bit about planetary boundaries, so I won't recreate the wheel and go into too much depth here. But of course, as we all know, our planet is facing these three major planetary crises. We have climate change, and that, of course, is supported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was established in 1988. We have biodiversity loss. And of course, we have IPBES, which was created in 2012, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, to support that particular planetary crisis. And then, in addition, last year, as many of you will be aware, the ISPCWP was ratified, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution. And their work is still to really start, but it also fits really nicely with the Plastics Treaty that was really established at a very similar time. So one of the things that we really need to be mindful when we're thinking around chemicals and also biodiversity loss and climate change, that these different situations are not in isolation. They mix together, they all have a relationship and interaction with each other, which is really why the exploration that we undertook, looking at potential sediment contamination in rivers in relation to flooding and climate change, was something that we felt was important to explore. So just to touch on an activity that was undertaken a few weeks ago on this topic, just to really demonstrate the importance within the scientific community around planetary boundaries for novel entities, which are things like chemicals. A workshop took place in May, which I was lucky enough to be involved with. You might be able to see me at the front of the picture, where all of the scientists who were involved in the discussions joined in for. And this was a really nice workshop because it was looking at what do we already know around chemicals and plastics, and what are the gaps gaps? And do we have data to be able to plug any of those gaps that haven't been considered at this moment in time? We're subsequently meeting this Friday and over the next few weeks to put together a report from that workshop with recommendations. And I'm really excited to be part of that and for what those recommendations might well be and how it might be useful to you potentially in the room. So sources of pollution into our freshwater it come from many different situations, and similarly that can be from our waste treatment centres that are releasing treated material into our freshwater environments. Of course, certainly in the UK and many other countries, the water is the sort of the effluent from these treatment systems does not really remove any chemical contamination, and therefore that is then emitted into our freshwater systems. Similarly, we have agricultural runoff, which might be releasing things like microplastics from farming into the river systems. It might also be releasing pharmaceuticals with regards to animal excrement that might well pass through into the water body. So, and similarly from our factories with regards to releasing of substances. So there's a whole host of different situations where chemicals will get into our environments. And of course, that's not just necessarily microplastics or nanoplastics, it's a whole range of different substances. That chemical cocktail, in truth. So within our aquatic or freshwater environments, of course, we have our river water. We have our sediment that tends to be at the bottom of the bed of our river. And then we have, of course, organisms living within that environment. That might well be macroinvertebrates, the small bugs and beasties that we find present in our fresh waters, and similarly fish and other species that might well be present. So research has clearly demonstrated that the contaminants from chemicals and microplastics can be consumed by the organisms that live in our freshwater habitats, and that those substances can also potentially accumulate in their bodies, and something that we call bioaccumulate, and suddenly they can also be moved up the food chain. So, for example, if you have a macroinvertebrate that has eaten some plastics or other chemical contaminants, and then a fish comes along to eat that macroinvertebrate, then they will be increasing their dose within their body. And similarly, if a human then also ate that fish, it would move up the food chain. So that bioaccumulation is a quite important process in which pollutants can move from species to species, and escalating the potential challenge around contamination. So a classic example that I'm sure you've all heard of, where this approach was undertaken, was in 1956 in the Bay of Minamata in Japan, when methyl mercury was released from a chemical company into the Bay of Minamata. That contaminated the fish, and subsequently humans ate those fish and became contaminated themselves, and Minamata disease evolved from that. So if we think about our river structure, usually a river starts at a source. It can be on higher ground. And then that water travels through the countryside or wherever that river might well be, where its channel is. And then eventually, after several different tributaries join that river from different areas, it will go out into an estuary and then potentially out into the ocean. So On its travels, the water isn't just a pure substance moving downstream. It collects material on its path. So that might be sediments, soils, it might be leaves, it might be a whole host of different materials that churn around with the water because it's very fast moving at source. And then as it moves down towards the estuaries, the flow of the water tends to slow down and it releases its sediment, which is being spun around in the water when it's faster moving. And that's what creates the mudflaps that we have within our estuary systems. But that sediment is also being displaced along the stretch of the water when the water, the stretch of the river when the water might slow down. But it can also, as the water level rises through perhaps heavy rainfall or snow melts, that can also speed up the water and then interfere with what is being deposited from those sediments. So this is just to give you an idea about how a river system looks and operates, because it's quite important to be able to then appreciate the challenges around contamination of rivers, but then also how to potentially deal with these situations as well. So rivers, as I just mentioned, they're fast flowing. They're basically dynamic systems. No one river is the same. Some are wider, some are deeper. Some of them have a longer stretch than others as well. But what you tend to always find in rivers is something that's called a riffle pool system. So riffles tend to be areas where you have stones that are built up into little piles, or you might have, a tree branch that's fallen off into the water. It changes the flow of the water. It makes it churned up, and you'll see in the picture that it's often got a froth on the top. So it's more vibrant. It's got more oxygen in that type of water. And then once you sort of move down through the river, you might find areas that are slightly deeper. And that depth means the water's moving more slowly. And those tend to have less oxygen as a result. So this undulation of riffles and pools really can have a sort of change the way that both contaminants are or chemicals are situated within river systems, but also the way that we sample them, and also the way that the sediment that we're talking about today moves within it. You'll see from the bottom picture, we've got the flowing water, and then it's demonstrating that the sediment or the rock at the bottom of the river, the sediment bed, and that the sediments that are being churned up by the water as it's moving, because it's holding those sediments, some are being released. And those releases, if they're large particles of sediment, they might well sink to the river floor. Or if they're small pieces of clay or silt, they might well just be suspended within the water column. So this is the River Dumfries, the River Nith in Dumfries, which is a local river to the university that I work at. And you'll see that the first picture here is on a lovely summer's day. The water is very, very calm. And you can see in the top picture where that was taken, I think when it was a little colder, because I've got a woolly hat on, but still the water is, relatively calm. It's within its channel, and it's not overspilling at that point. The bottom picture on here is the River Nith when it bursted its banks due to flooding. Now you'll see when the river has flood, it's escalated, it's moved over the boundaries of the river channel, and it's moved out into areas where it wouldn't naturally be. It's covered the terrestrial environment. It's moved into some homes that are on the banks of the river, causing damage and contamination potentially. So in these situations, the sediments that are within our river system are not within the channel anymore. They're being spread out across that surrounding land as well. So some will be in the sediment and then some will be spread out along the land. And therefore, what's within those sediments has the potential to interact with both humans, animals, and a system where it wouldn't naturally fall. So river sediments have the ability to bond with quite a lot of contaminants. Microplastics, POPs, many different substances that we're all really interested in and have the risk of causing contamination. And so as a consequence of that, all of those contaminants that are bound within the sediment, in addition to those ones that might well be in the water column, are distributing out over the banks to basically cause quite a challenge. But of course, what is present there is very dependent on that particular system and what they have been exposed to. So, for example, in the River Nith, there are significant problems around metal contamination, for example, because it's a mining area historically. Um, and also we know that there are pharmaceuticals present. We know there are no PFAS. We know there are microplastics. So it's a mixture of different things that are present in that environment that could be spreading across. So this is a picture of the River Nith, and you'll see the blue line is the river itself. The block of red colour is actually the average distance that floodwater tends to travel across the history of the River Nith. Now, I should say that the River Nith is prone to flooding, but climate change is definitely increasing the scale that this is taking place and the frequency. You'll also see that there are red lines striating across that block of red. Now, these red lines correspond to the maximum flood incidences that the River Nith has ever had. And it's had two really significant major floods in the last 100 years, which are corresponding to by those red lines. So you can see what was in the blue line has spread a long way across, in this particular instance, agricultural fields. And on several occasions, it's travelled even further across those different environments. So what our research did is we initially did a desk study to look at contamination and global sediment contamination globally to identify what is happening. What methods have been used to actually extract the contaminants? How have they been monitored? And also to look at the concentrations that have been found globally from river sediment, because river sediment is a really under-researched area. We do a lot of work with the water column, but not as much with the sediment. And what we know specifically is that contaminants that bind with sediment can be there for an awful long time. We're not talking a few weeks, we're talking years. And as a consequence of that, this legacy contamination over the history of that river is playing a role in what's happening in that environment. So what we did was we undertook some basic experimental work as well within that river system to try and understand, is the contamination within the sediment that we find in the river transferring across to the terrestrial environment when a flooding incident occurs? And therefore, the hypothesis would be, if that's the case, then it has the potential to contaminate food, might be grown in those agricultural fields, but also then how might that pass through the food chain, perhaps to animals that are grazing on that environment and to humans that then might well consume those food substances. At the moment, because this is a work in progress, we have looked to identify if the contaminants that we've been finding in the stream, in the river itself, spread with flooding incidents onto the terrestrial environment. And we have identified that yes, they do. Why is that? Well, we know that suspended particles and matter, both organic and inorganic, bind with sediments, such as POPs, such as microplastics. And we found also that microplastics, smaller than 2 millimeters in size, have been really abundant in deeper river water. And similarly, we've also found that around that as well, within those microplastics, you can get those biofilms on them, which Michael had mentioned, which then potentially have risks around antimicrobial resistance within the environment and for humans. So within shallow rivers, ones that are shallower, they have the benefit of having direct sunlight shining on the riverbed, potentially. And as a consequence of that, it allows for the degradation of some of these contaminants that are bound to the sediments to take place, and also by the breakdown of microorganisms that are present in that river. So we know, as I've already mentioned, our study demonstrated that microplastics were transported from the sediment by flooding and through over onto the riverbanks and to the associated fields. Other studies have demonstrated this as well. We're very, very conscious as well that that not every system is exactly the same, and our plans moving forward are to look at this on a much broader scale than just one river to identify if our results stand up as a consequence. We know that basically flooding and flooding incidents are increasing, and therefore the potential risk of this situation is escalating a little bit. And we still have so many unknowns around this that haven't been explored. We know that POPs can be in the environment for months and decades, and therefore this is a real challenge, and as I've mentioned, around legacy implications. So the desk component of our work, we identified that actually from a global scale, there's been quite a lot of work done on sediment sampling analysis to understand a range of different concentrations that are found in the environment. There's some really nice data out there that we reported on in our paper. However, the significant concern is the fact that researchers are not using necessarily the standard methods for actually undertaking sampling or the analysis of the samples. And that means, of course, when we're thinking of yourselves and policymakers, that evidence pool of information has gaps because you need everything to, be in parallel so that you can make those, so scientists can make strong recommendations potentially, and for policymakers to reflect on that to decide if, that you want to make some changes. So this is a significant issue that needs a lot of work around standardizing and using standard tests. So as a base of our study, we made 5 recommendations. One of those was that it would be really sensible to undertake routine sediment sampling and analysis for microplastics and other contaminants within areas that are likely to flood to protect food security. Also, we could use that flood extent mapping that I've already shown you as a way of predicting areas where there are likely to be floods, to use those as sampling sites, both to look at the sediment within the river system, also within the soils and the crops within those zones. And that would then be a really sort of robust way of trying to understand the situation and prevent some risks. The second recommendation, which I think you can appreciate, is the adoption of standard methods and protocols is really, really important. We have standard methods, not for everything, but for quite a few. So the development of standard methods for everything and, trying to encourage researchers to not waver from those processes will allow the data to be comparable for you. The third recommendation is the standard quality tools have been published for some, but not everything. And so having thresholds of limits and other tools to be able to put together analysis and understanding of what's happening would be really important. And again, at the moment, there are holes in this area. Fourthly, we thought that it would be really, really nice to have an evidence platform. So the bringing of together of data around a range of different topics, around the contamination with microplastics and other substances, to put together toxicological databases, including not just sediment, but other substances as well, in order to try and understand what's happening better. And finally, we thought capacity building was really a significant area for development, thinking about investment in education around development of sampling tools, and also thinking about safer chemical alternatives to those that are currently being used, which of course is a big area of exploration at the moment. Also, thinking about training within universities, not only about the new tools, but actually green chemistry and other skills are incredibly important to advance our understanding and the resources that we're using. And similarly, multidisciplinary collaborations are really important to tackle these wicked problems. But communication is often a challenge. So thinking about languages that cross those disciplines can also help to reduce some of the silos that we're seeing, and then will help to transfer knowledge more broadly. So, in addition to the study that I've just shown you and the recommendations, I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things that we have been involved with, linking to that sort of safer chemistry side of things, thinking about alternatives and thinking about those gaps that might well be there for science-based policy making. So we produced a paper looking at the European Green Deal and their ambition for a toxic-free environment, and look to identify what gaps are there to potentially achieve that. We've also done some work building on John Elkington's book Green Swans, which is all about sustainability, to actually look about, are there any green swans within chemical pollution? So green swans are success stories. Black swans are those things that are really challenging and potentially causing harm. And grey swans are those things that could potentially move from a risky area to a more sustainable area and a green swan approach. So it's a really nice paper that looks at where we are now, what we face in the future, and potentially where can we move forward to be more sustainable around chemicals management. We've also done some work with the European Commission where we were looking at research gaps and recommendations in order to improve safe and sustainable by design framework. And this was done through consultation with a really large number of stakeholders, this case scientists, to try and understand where are we now, what do we know, where are we going to be potentially in a few years' time, and what are the really long-term goals that we really need to work on in order to be able to generate both safe and sustainable by design chemicals and substances. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight, Michael's already mentioned the new science policy panel for chemicals, waste and pollution, and of course the plastics treaty, and of course we have the global framework of chemicals that has just come on board as well. So we developed a conceptual framework to help set priority sort of tasks and activities around chemicals and waste pollution. So it's using a risk-based strategy, and it will allow us to prioritize, the topics that we should try to explore first of all, and those things that can hang on a little bit before we explore them, to try and move forward as quick as we can on those really challenging subjects. So that brings me to the end of my talk today. I would really like to thank the organisers for inviting me and you, the audience, for joining us today. And if anybody has any questions later on, then please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloor, for this great presentation. I found your research findings on the interactions of macro and nanoplastics with the reverse sediments very fascinating. And I hope our participants will look up the work of Dr. Bloor and learn further about that. I already see that people are liking the presentations. We have quite a few questions, so stay until the end with us. And now we move on to our last speaker, Dr. Halshka Grachik. She's a technical specialist on occupational safety and health at the International Labour Organizations, based in Geneva, Switzerland. In her role, Dr. Grachik manages the ILO's hazardous substances portfolio, which spans across all work sectors and occupations worldwide, and the portfolio assesses toxics, chemicals, and waste along the life cycle of global supply chains. It's great to have you today with us. We welcome your presentation, and the floor is yours. We see your presentation, but we cannot hear you.
Now you can.
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you very much for having me. You can still see my presentation, yes? I've lost something here, but I hope you can still see it.
Yes, we see it.
Perfect. Okay. My name is Halshka Gracek. I am a technical specialist at the Occupational Safety and Health and Working Environment branch. That's part of the International Labour Organization here in Geneva. This is our headquarters. Today I'm presenting as a technical specialist, but I'm presenting on a topic that's very dear to my heart. A few years ago, I would have presented myself as a nanoparticle researcher. Now I've moved on to policy, but it's great to be back in the field and to learn from the excellent presentations we had just before and to engage in these discussions, sort of making the gaps, bridging the gaps between the science and the policy, and seeing if we can apply lessons learned from research done in the early 2000s on nanotechnology. So already want to thank very much the organizers for bringing me here. Thank you so much for the participants for joining and for staying with us, and for hopefully a fruitful exchange that we'll have at the end. I have to say I already learned so much from Michael and Michelle, so I'm very inspired now. So what will we talk about today in this presentation? We'll move a little bit away from the science and look more about policy implications. It's a more conceptual presentation, but what I hope to really highlight in this presentation is that we are living in a new world where microplastics, nanoplastics are an emerging concern for much of the world, for many scientists, but especially for society. And what we know is that even if it's considered an emerging problem, we can apply a framework for managing solutions, for managing different ways of working together, and for different ways of achieving evidence-based policy. So the start of nanoparticle research that started back, let's say, late 1990s with the huge increase in the production of engineered nanoparticles led to great increases in research, in policy discussions, in new types of workings between scientists and regulators. And there's a lot that we can learn from that experience. So the starting point and the platform that I'll really talk about today is the fact that we're not starting from zero when it comes to research on microplastics and nanoplastics. We have a number of years of nanotox experience and also policy examples of how we can make safer chemicals management a reality. So I want to take you back in time a little bit, not much back in time, but let's say the starts, let's say late 1990s, early 2000s. This was a time, as I mentioned, that there was huge increases in applications of engineered nanoparticles in engineering, in medicine, in food production, in different types of fields. There was a very significant interest in these kind of consumer applications. But there was an even greater interest by the science community and also by society about potential human health impacts and pathways of toxicity, questions about dose response. And there was a lot of difficulty here when it came to regulatory challenges because of the speed at which nanoparticles were being produced and being applied in our consumer goods. The regulatory challenges that were of particular interest to our research group and also the work that we're doing now with the International Labor Organization is the concern for occupational exposures. Knowing that while consumers are being exposed to some of these particles, there's an even greater exposure potential for working populations that are on the front lines. So workers that are exposed during the manufacture and production of different goods, and also at the end of the life cycle, during disposal and during waste management. So here you see the graphic of something that we were very used to seeing around this time is the sharp increase in the number of scientific publications that dealt with the term nanoparticle or nanomaterial, responding to this big application from the consumer side of using engineered nanoparticles. And in this moment, we saw that there was a vast number of national nanotech initiatives in these years. There was a number of research programs developed nationally, regionally, some globally. One of the ones that I would like to highlight today, because I think we could learn a lot from how the research was conducted and how the bridge was made to policy development, was the Swiss National Science Foundation project called the National Research Project 64, known as Opportunities and Risks of Nanomaterials, which started around 2010. And this was a truly multidisciplinary national research program that cut across different scientific fields, from medicine to public health, to occupational safety and health and industrial hygiene, to energy, to construction. And it looked to bridge together different researchers and study nanoparticles across their life cycle. So from fabrication to industrial applications, to worker exposures, and then to disposal pathways. And this was such a prolific research program because the idea was that there are opportunities from different consumer applications. However, the new application of these types of particles need to have an appropriate risk assessment in order to guarantee safety. And so we already see a number of parallels when it comes to the question of nano and plastic, micro and nanoplastic research. So here I would love to show you these slides because they really show the overlap and what happened towards the end of the last curve in the last slide, where you saw around 2012 the huge spike in publications on the topic of nanoparticles. So here in this slide, we see on the left a graph that's showing publications with the term micro, that looks specifically at particles and polystyrene, which is a type of plastic. So it's looking at plastic spheres the number of publications looking at plastic spheres. So we see the sharp increase until around 2012, 2015, this region, then we see a decrease. At the same time, what we see in blue, what's highlighted in the red square, is the increase now in the studies that use the term microplastic and polystyrene. Same thing on the right side, you see the same trend happening with nano. So as you have a decrease in the number of studies that use the term nanoparticle and polystyrene, but not nanoplastic, you see that decrease happening at the same time, a mirror image of an increase of studies that use the term nanoplastic. So here we see this research shift. So we see we're moving from nanoparticle to nanoplastic. Indeed, in many of these studies, these are perhaps identical tox studies that are looking at the same particles, but are now using a different terminology and then adding to that body of evidence that we already saw from nanoparticle research. But let's look a bit deeper into this question of, can we be comparing engineered nanoparticles or even incidental nanoparticles and micro and nanoplastics? How do they relate to each other? How are they different? We see, first of all, that just being in the nano range, of course, gives us very similar toxicological mechanisms. We're looking at nano range materials that have completely different properties, completely different behaviors than their bulk counterparts. They have, in many cases, similar toxicological pathways, whether that's inducing oxidative stress, inflammation, or leading to translocation throughout the body after being inhaled. However, we see a number of very key differences, and it's critical that we highlight this here when we're talking about this unique link between nanoparticle research and nanoplastics research. And a lot of this information you've heard already from the previous speakers, Michael and Michelle, that have talked about the huge heterogeneity of microplastics and nanoplastics because of the hundreds and thousands of different chemical additives that nanoplastics can contain. You see this on the right side. The polymer types that could be used, the size range, the shape. And here, the question of degradation is extremely important because we see already a fragment of micro or nanoplastics can look very different than an engineered nanoparticle. We see these highly irregular shapes due to natural degradation, due to UV, temperature, time, environment. And we also see that the morphology can be very different. There was nice pictures in both the last presentations that really showed the diversity of micro and nanoplastics, so what they might look like, whether that's a fiber, a sphere, a different type of shape. But we have this big heterogeneity when it comes to the type of particles that we're encountering. So very different again from engineered nanoparticle research, where we were always thrilled to see a perfect bell curve of natural distribution of the sizes of the particles. Here, I think it's very different. We also must consider the issue of the Trojan horse effect, which is also described in the last few presentations, namely the idea of having the biofilm surround the nano or the microplastic, create its own plastic sphere, and create its own different types of toxicity and different types of hazard potential just because of that microenvironment that's happening. And here also we see the difference when it comes to regulations. Working with engineered nanoparticles and working in the occupational safety and health space, a big question was the development of occupational exposure limits and how we can try to quantify the exposure of workers to these hazardous materials, which is a very different situation right now when it comes to nanoplastics. So just a word about the terminology, because it's something we'll come back to. It's very important to recognize too that there are different terminologies that are used, and just because we're using the prefix nano doesn't mean that we have the same terminology from engineered nanoparticles to nanoplastics. So we see that we do have a different definitions. We go up to 100 nanometers, the official definition from ISO many years ago about engineered nanoparticles, but different when it comes to nanoplastics. And this is mainly due to not only the specific size number, but about the characteristics. So this is about particle behavior and not necessarily about a strict limit when it comes to going only up to 100 nanometers. Now, however, the terminologies here, I mean, they're quite well accepted. So we know that a microplastic up to 5 millimeters, and we have that boundary of 1 micron, 1,000 nanometers, often for nanoplastics. So let's look a bit deeper into this question, how nanoplastics might relate to nanoparticles, engineered ones specifically. Following the steps of risk assessment, we would start with hazard identification. What do these particles look like? So I already described some of the differences between engineered nanoparticles. We have the question of the type of material that these micro or nanoplastics can be made of, the hundreds of thousands of different chemicals, the chemical cocktails that was very well described by Michelle. And also here, I'd like to highlight what Michael mentioned is the question of the toxicity that comes from long-term degradation, which is not something that was often encountered in nanoparticle, classic engineered nanoparticle research because of the often biopersistence of some of these nanoparticles and the single type of element that usually made up these engineered nanoparticles. So it's a very different space than the one from engineered nanoparticles. Looking to exposure assessment, we also face a lot of differences between engineered nanoparticle research and micro and nanoplastic research. Here, as was shown also from the last two presentations, we know that exposure to micro and to nanoplastics is, in fact, involuntarily, effectively unavoidable at this stage due to the proliferation of these plastic fragments through the air, through soil, through water, and throughout the biosphere. So this is an interesting situation that scientists find themselves in because unlike when we were studying engineered nanoparticles, we no longer have an unexposed control population to compare ourselves to. So we know that there's more than 1,300 species where plastic fragments have been found. And so we know that the ubiquitous exposure of micro and nanoplastic poses a difficulty for scientific endeavors, but also really makes the plastics problem as a standalone when it comes to widespread exposure. Now let's look at some of the routes of exposure and the impact on the human body. Here we're following similar particle dynamics. If we look at nanoplastics, we're following similar particle dynamics than engineered nanoparticles in that we're following a Brownian motion, usually through the lungs where the smaller particles, the smaller the particle, the deeper that it could go into the lung, the larger particles penetrating higher up, and the smallest ones going all the way to the bottom, sometimes in the alveolar region if they're small enough and able to cross the barriers and then move throughout the bloodstream and translocation. So we see from a number of studies, we have confirmed the presence of micro and nanoplastics throughout various organs because of these translocation pathways. And here there's a lot of evidence that can be learned from engineered nanoparticle research, where we were able to do a lot of tagging of particles, following particles throughout the body, understanding where they could go based on their size range. But, of course, as mentioned, micro and nanoplastics, very different than engineered nanoparticles. We have the whole biocorona effect of the different absorbed types of metals or chemicals onto the top of the particle, potential agglomeration of the particles that are happening. So we have a similar framework for translocation with many different caveats based on the heterogeneity of the micro and nanoplastics. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the exposure assessment, but take it a bit further onto the occupational side, because this is something that we worked with a lot, and highlight the fact that where we are right now in micro and nanoplastic research is very similar to where we were when it came to nanoparticle research a decade ago, in that the understanding was there that we are all exposed. However, workers will face that double burden of exposure. Millions of workers. We know that there's up to, for example, 20 million informal waste pickers around the world. These waste pickers that are dealing with plastics every day, doubling their exposure. They're being exposed through environmental pathways, the way that we're exposed, but they're also being exposed because of their jobs. And it's not just the waste pickers, it's also from high energy processes, 3D printing, different types of production procedures where workers can be exposed. And again, we're still at that stage where we're lacking the exposure limits to be able to understand biological monitoring for workers, and we're also lacking the ability to control those exposures. Here, I'd like to point to this interesting case study from the 1990s that looked at workers exposed to nylon flock in 5 processing facilities. And here, this was an interesting example of an emerging occupational disease that was identified and was named flock workers disease, flock workers lung. And it came from exposure to micro fragments of nylon flock. So of a type of polymer that was then depositing deep into the lung and causing these impacts for workers. And so already we saw in the 1990s, we had an occupational disease that was being caused by microplastics without the proper terminology for it yet. So this brings us to the idea that, as in many emerging occupational and public health exposures, workers often serve as the early warning for public health in society, the canary in the coal mine, which is the classic terminology that's used for this, in that workers are exposed to higher doses for chronic time periods and therefore can be a signal of the potential toxicity of exposure to a new contaminant. So where are we now? There was a fantastic paper published last year in Nature Medicine about where we stand when it comes to the health impacts of microplastics and nanoplastics. And it was fascinating to read the conclusion because it truly reminded me of the work that was done on nanoparticle research a decade ago, in that there's a few basic conceptions where we stand right now. One, exposure is certain. We know exposure is happening. Harm is plausible. We have evidence. But we still have knowledge gaps that limit hard conclusions and limit that undeniable evidence base to lead to policies. So what do we need? We need more harmonized methods. We need more collaboration. And there's a few key lessons learned that I'd like to share with you to wrap up the presentation. So before I get into the lessons learned from nanoparticle research and how we apply them to micro and nanoplastic research, just want to explain that there's a number of lessons learned. I know that I was limited in time today, so we'll just go through the most important ones. And interestingly enough, already the previous presentations touched on some of these issues, so I'm glad to hear that. The first takeaway that we can make from this presentation is that engineered nanoparticles are not the same as microplastics. They're not the same as nanoplastics. Engineered nanoparticles are different than microplastics, which are very different from nanoplastics. So we cannot extrapolate cleanly across these disciplines. But what we can do is take some of these lessons learned forward. Things like establishing clear terminologies and harmonized methods for research, for standardized methodologies of how to analyze different fragments, how to look at toxicity data, how to conduct dose response assessments. These are very importantly needed for regulatory approaches. Michelle brought this up too, the importance of terminology, I believe, or methodologies for sediment sampling. But it's exactly this idea that without the proper terms, without the proper metrics, it's very difficult to then bring a solid evidence base forward to regulators and say, this is what we need to do based on all of this evidence we've collected over the years. So number one lesson learned, critically, to establish clear terminologies and harmonized methods for nanoplastics and microplastics research. The next one, also discussed in the last presentations, was the idea of bridging the divide that does unfortunately exist in many places between environmental scientists, human toxicologists, and regulators. We know from nanotoxicology that the problem spans too many disciplines for one single community to solve alone. We've already, in the last two presentations, touched on a number of different types of scientists and policymakers, whether they're engineers or industrial hygienists or human toxicologists or public policymakers. These are all part of the community that needs to solve this problem together. So this is something that was clearly established in the Swiss National Science Foundation project that truly tried to bring together not only multidisciplinary researchers, but also tried them in their own work to create those linkages with global scientists and global research institutes. The third part is now goes a bit beyond not only bridging those communities, but now it's about engaging stakeholders and engaging consumers and engaging broader society to achieve real world impact. As we saw with nanoparticle research, there's always fear where there's uncertainty. And there's a big risk in not engaging stakeholders early on. There's a big risk in miscommunicating potential risks of different types of exposures. And so here, we've learned that lesson, not just from nanoparticle research, but from many other platforms as well, that early engagement of key stakeholders and broader society, civil society, is very important to achieve that real world impact. We know this ourselves from working at the ILO, that social dialogue, which means working with our tripartite constituents, bringing employers and industry, bringing workers and trade unions, and bringing governments to the table early on in policy development is the key to success and is the key for uptake and implementation. Here's my last lesson learned, that we shouldn't be starting from scratch. I already started with this slide at the beginning that even though we're looking at a relatively new area of work in terms of the complexity that's come up, the methods and the frameworks and the institutions and the researchers, they exist. We shouldn't be rebuilding from zero. We should be transferring what works and also what doesn't work. And importantly, here we've talked about some different frameworks. We should be leveraging the governance framework that already exists. We talked about the Basel Convention, the Global Framework for Chemicals, the Science Policy Panel. We also have a number of OECD test guidelines. We have international labor standards that already exist to protect workers from different types of chemical exposures, including micro and nanoplastics. So we don't want to wait to start applying the policy. We'll never get to that moment of perfect science to lead to the most perfect policies. And this was a lesson learned when we were developing an evidence base for setting occupational exposure limits to engineered nanoparticles. While there were lab studies and tox studies and human exposure studies and mega analyses and reviews being conducted, workers were still being exposed. Workers were still suffering from health impacts. And so it's better to keep the public policy moving while the research is moving and not wait for that perfect solution. So I had a few more slides, but I think we're getting close to the end. So I think I'll wrap it up here. My slides were anyway about the global framework for chemicals and the need to engage here. But I think there was a lot of information. So I'll leave it here and I'll turn it back to you and I'll see if there's any questions for the discussion. Thank you, Ranush.
Great. Thank you so much, Alshka, for this great presentation. First, foremost, I apologize for mispronouncing your family name.
Not at all.
Thank you so much. It was great that you highlighted the occupational exposure to macro and nanoplastics, and I think it's really nice for the participants to understand the distinction between engineered nanoparticles, nanomaterials versus the macro and nanoplastics. So I think in that sense, it is very helpful. This is not the end. We still have a few more minutes to respond to some of your questions. I see our speakers took quite a few of the questions and responded them in the chat box, but we have a lot more questions here. So I address those questions to all the three speakers. Please do jump in. So the first question is about how policies and reforms in Africa, but maybe perhaps I broaden it for developing countries, could help them? And what do you think from your perspective, given that you're involved in policy processes, can make sure that nobody's left behind? If you have any comments to that, please do jump in, and keep the answers short, such that we could take a few questions.
Yeah, I think it raises an important issue about regions in the global south and capacity building and how we can develop a more formal program for what the needs are to identify those first. And then we have had very successful programs through the Nansen program here in Norway, through the Norwegian NORAD program for development and aid, and then also the IAEA technical program, which is already having a global program on microplastic and capacity building in over 100 countries, including several in Africa. So there are some programs existing. Maybe the need is to help notify people that these are available for member states. That in especially in Africa, the program at IAEA and Nansen is something that's been going on quite long. In the case of the Nansen program, it's over 50 years in aid, not all of it on microplastic, of course, but that has become more of a focus as we meet the needs of member states. But also the IAEA Technical Cooperation Program can, I think, fit a lot of the capacity building needs for Africa.
Great, thank you, Michael. Any other comments, or should I move to the next question? Yeah, okay, so I see no reaction. There is a technical question about the chemicals in plastics. So for people who don't have that background, maybe either Michelle or Michael, if you could comment, is it possible to separate chemicals from plastics technically?
Very difficult. I think is the key one. I don't know if you've got anything more to add to that, Michael.
Well, it's expensive, and
Yeah.
I put a couple of really novel techniques that are expensive, but there are solvent and CO2 based methods to remove chemicals from plastic and make sort of a chemical free plastic residual that can be reused. But then you're still left with having to process those chemicals through some other method, maybe pyrolysis or some other treatment. So you're still left with a treatment of those chemicals. But it is available, but it's very expensive. And there are some limitations. I don't think we're right at the industrial scale yet, but there are some new projects in the EU that are addressing this with some small businesses that are working on technology. So it could be coming in the future. It's possible.
Great, thank you for that. There is also a question, do you know of any best available technologies to remediate the environment that is contaminated with nanoparticles, such that they are not mobilized in the environment further? Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that that question also was asking how do you remove them to avoid also legacy contamination, if I remember correctly. And that's a bit of a problem because obviously they'll be all mixed together potentially, or all in the same environment. So um, you would have to look potentially at source of where these substances were coming in to try and avoid actually having them released, I think, to avoid the legacy side of things. But again, it is possible to remove, nanoplastics and things from water, for example. But doing that on a large scale is going to be a very expensive, as again has been mentioned, and I don't think we're quite there yet to be able to necessarily implement it on a larger scale.
Great, thank you so much. A question specifically to Halshka here. They ask, from a policy perspective, what role should security agencies play in responding to and managing macro and nanoplastic contamination, especially in Africa, maybe / developing world? where environmental contamination is already an emerging challenge?
Thanks for the question. Well, I think here we really have that principle of all organizations should be working together on this challenge because it's exactly that, especially in situations where there are a number of competing priorities, like in a number of different regions around the world, where safety organizations, whoever is ready to step up to the challenge and is able to bring in different stakeholders to work together on this issue, I think that there's a huge role that they can play. And also, it's a role that, there's not one size fits all for regions. And that's the key here, that in different regions, we might not need different stakeholders that are working together. And it's not one only paradigm for how to respond.
Great. Thank you, Halshka. Another question, and maybe this is for all the three speakers. To understand the dynamics and pathways of macro and nanoparticles in the environment, you first need to understand the fate of microplastics leader to the environment. I'm wondering, how do you connect and model these pathways? What assumptions do you usually make? How do you connect mass units often reported for mismanaged plastic waste with microplastic particles unit? Thanks.
I guess I can take this a little bit and then maybe springboard the discussion. I think what the question really is focused upon is materials flow analysis and how we do that as a scientific community. And it's a very diverse set of experts that are needed to do it properly. You need to have people who are involved in the plastic trade to understand the litter aspect of it, and then probably some chemical engineers to understand some of the plastic additives and those flows as well throughout the pathways eventually up into humans, which would involve some human health scientists. But ultimately, having a pretty traditional materials flow analysis linked with machine learning is really what a lot of people are working on now to look at fate transport and also sources. The degradation studies, too, about how macroplastic or big plastic pieces get into the smaller microplastic and nanoplastic particles, that's starting to be more and more well studied. And that includes a whole another suite of scientists often focused on polymer chemistry and degradation. So I think it can be done with this materials flow analysis, but it's like the other speakers have talked about today, that it will require a diverse set of expertise and a very broad array of different interdisciplinary approaches.
Thanks, Michael. Michelle or Halshka, would you like to comment also? Or...
I think Michael addressed it really quite well. I don't think I've got anything else to add from my side.
Great, thank you very much. And looking at the time, it's 3:42 p.m. There are still a lot more questions to take. However, we're running out of time. Thank you so much for your engagement. This has been great, and it shows that a lot of you have a lot of interests in this topic. I saw a couple of questions about further learning opportunities. Do follow BRS Conventions and UNITAR's YouTube accounts. There you can find the recordings of our previous webinars, but also you can find webinars on a range of topics related to chemicals, waste, and macro and nanoplastics. With that, I give it to Oliver to give you his impression of this session and to wrap it up.
Great. Thank you very much, Manoush. And of course, thanks very much to Michael, Michelle, and Hauschka for their presentations. I will just give a few reflections. I certainly won't try to summarize some of that science. I hope it's been very useful to you. I very much appreciated Michael's presentation. He acknowledged that, or he sort of started with introducing the triple planetary crisis, as well as referencing a need for a plastics convention. We also heard later about the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution, the Global Framework on Chemicals, and the Basel Convention. These are, of course, important frameworks for us. I thought his comments on bonding of plastics and impacts of how these shed in different environments very interesting. And he also explained research indicating that maybe we're still awaiting some of the most toxic components of plastic waste, with nanoplastics perhaps the last or generally still to be released in the environment. Thanks also to Michelle. This was great to hear of so much in-depth knowledge on rivers and parts of Scotland. We heard about the chemicals iceberg. And this interesting fact that many thousands of chemicals we still don't have or understand the true characteristics of. And this is compounded when we think about the cocktail effects already from chemicals that we don't individually have data on. We had an interesting exploration of how rivers form and change over time and as they proceed towards the sea and ocean, and how this can heavily impact where contaminants are released or settle, and how this may affect or influence sampling. We also heard how contaminants in rivers can be mobilized during flooding incidents, with one recommendation that regular flooding sites would therefore be likely sources or recommended sources for regular testing. On testing, we also heard that recommendation a few times with Hauschka as well, that there should be more standardized testing. A third recommendation from Michelle was again mirrored by Michael for establishing threshold limits. And also, it was interesting to hear of the ideas of development of a global platform, capacity building and training, which of course Unitar is very interested in, and that call for sustainable alternatives and sustainable chemistry. From Hauschka, we went a little bit more into background on research and that reminder that we have decades of research on nano and microplastics, though also over this time a large increase in production and use of nanomaterials. Hauschka also highlighted how the increase in research publications has shown a shift from the use of the term nanoparticles, moving to referencing nanoplastics. She further outlined how the engineered nanoparticles can have very different characteristics compared with nanoplastics, and how this creates very different levels of degradation. She also was closing her presentation linking back to exposure in people and workers and highlighting the lack of exposure limits. Also, that reminder of ILO's approach to developing agreements and activities in a tripartite fashion, emphasizing the need to work across stakeholders and sectors as we develop policy and further science, acknowledging that she did say we cannot always wait for the perfect science and perfect policy. These are some of the key things that I heard today and were most interesting to me. So again, from my side, thanks very much to everyone. As Manoush mentioned, we have done a series on nanoplastics, so we'd be very grateful to work with the Basel Convention Secretariat, with colleagues across the IOMC, such as ILO, and we appreciate greatly the experts, so 2 who have joined today and 2 who have, many who have joined us before as well. So we will be sharing links to where we will post the recording. We will hopefully put up the presentations and continue to share information with as many of you as possible. So thanks all for joining today, and thanks to you, to Manoush, for moderating, and back to you to close up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oliver, and many thanks to everybody who joined us today. Do not forget to follow us on social media and on our YouTube pages. That would help you be informed about our next webinar. And do reach out to the speakers or to us if you like to engage and learn more about their work. And once again, thanks for joining us today, and wish you a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the organization.
Thanks, everyone. We talk soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.